Chapter 14. She said soon. She said it twice, Holly insisted. She's an immortal, said Alexia gloomily. Who knows what soon means to someone who's lived 5,000 years? Empy snuggled against Holly's knees, and she stroked his head. Do you want to play the Empire City game? Tundra asked. Holly nodded listlessly. All right, you ask. Tundra sat up. Who's the mayor of Empire City? He asked. Easy, Mr. William Strong. Easy, was it? Said Tundra, ruffled. How about this? Who rules the Department of Street Cleaning? You'll never get that one. Holly stuck out her tongue at him. Colonel George Edwin Waring, Jr. Holly laughed. Colonel George Edwin Waring, Jr. Whatever that means. I'll give you the point anyway, said Tundra generously. But here's a good one. You're at the corner of 10th Street and 5th Avenue. How many blocks must you walk to reach Washington Square? Holly closed her eyes and counted. 5 if you count the alley. What's a block? Asked Empy. Mortals arrange their cities in squares, each divided by a street. They call each square a block, explained Holly. Alexia regarded Holly with awe. How do you know all this? Tundra and I decided that I should get ready for my journey by finding out everything I could about the Empire City. I've been reading some of Papa's books. And she made a map of the city using the telescope, said Tundra. Research, said Euphemia approvingly. Very owlish. Just try it, urged Alexia. Holly looked at the gigantic amaranthine gates. The golden post had long since been restored, and there was no sign of the havoc that had once been wreaked upon them. The gems that lined the golden bars glittered in the afternoon sun. Holly's heart began to thump. What if the curse had just sort of faded and nobody knew it? What if she walked right up to the gates and pulled them open? What if that was all it took to be free? You won't know until you try, said Alexia. Holly glanced back at Vobis, calmly waiting in the snow. The horse offered no opinion. All right, Lexi, Holly said. What if? She took an unsteady breath and approached the shining metal. Maybe she stared up toward the heavens and could barely see the tops of the gates. With a shaking hand, she reached for the loop that held the latch and stopped. She could not lift the metal circle. It was immobile. Tentatively, she shook one golden bar and then pushed with all her might. The enormous gate did not even register a shiver. Then something caught her eye. On the other side, in the mortal realm, the snow was lined with shadows. Yet there was nothing that would cast a shadow, but the shadows existed, thin and patient, waiting. Her throat tightened, and she understood. These were the immortal souls, exiled from their destiny by the curse she had brought. Her eyes stung with tears. Maybe I could dig under it, Lexi was saying. She strolled toward the gate and began to paw at the snow near the post. No, Lexi, don't, Holly said urgently. We shouldn't be here. But the fox had already stopped. It's as though there's a wall inside the ground, she said, looking at her paws. I'm breaking my claws on it, even though I can't see it. She looked back at Holly. We must go. Yes, said Holly with relief. This is a sad place. Time enfolded the 5 friends in its patient arms. Holly turned 17, and the expected journey still did not occur. She did her lessons and spent long hours molding her clay figures. She enjoyed her friends and loved her parents, but always and under each moment she waited. There was something quiet and watchful in her face, a shadow of suspense on all her doings. Though Nicholas and Viviana did not know of Holly's unshakable belief that her destiny lay in the mortal world, they knew that their daughter was no longer content with childish things. They saw her gazing absently from the windows into the sea of trees below, and they recognized the longing in her eyes. One bright October morning, as Holly and Viviana sat together in Holly's snow-charmed sitting room, they heard heavy footsteps thumping down the hall. Nicholas entered, looking exasperated, and threw himself into a chair. It shuddered under the impact. Goodness, Nicholas, be careful, Viviana said, eyeing the chair. Nicholas sat in preoccupied silence. Finally, he burst out. There's nothing I can do about it. My hands are tied. Your hands are tied about what? Asked Viviana. The fairies, he said grimly. I'm going to have to enchant them. They're completely out of hand. Enchant them? What do you mean? Cried Holly. Cast a spell, maybe not on all of them, but on most. It's the only way to control them. Oh, not forever, he said, catching sight of Holly's stricken face, but for a few months. They're absolutely mad. Did you know what they did last night? Oh dear, said Viviana apprehensively. They broke into the doll shop and had a revel. And do you know what they did at that revel? Holly shook her head, wincing in advance. They ripped the head and limbs off every last doll in the shop and made a bonfire out by the lake. Didn't see anything wrong with it. We wanted to go skating by firelight, Nema Kelly tells me. Our entire stock of Christmas dolls. Hundreds of dolls. Christmas is only 2 months away. Didn't see anything wrong with it, Nicholas ranted. They probably didn't, love, said Viviana. I know. I'm sure they didn't. But that's just the problem. They've got absolutely no sense of responsibility. They've got no sense of proportion. They're complete savages. Oh, Papa, they're not, said Holly. They're wonderful. Of course, they're careless and wild, but that's because they live by their own lights. You know what they don't understand. You know that they don't understand the human world. It's not their fault. It's just the way they are. But what am I to do about the dolls? Demanded Nicholas. They're destroyed. Why don't you use your magic to make new dolls instead of locking up the fairies? Holly replied. Nicholas shook his head. It's not as easy as that. You see, even if I use magic, I have to envision the face of each doll first. And right now, I need hundreds and hundreds of dolls. That's not something I can do in a few weeks. But I suppose, he said unwillingly, I suppose that there's no help for it now. The dolls will have to look alike. Maybe if the goblins agree to take over the train shop, I can come up with 3 or 4 different dolls, but that's the extent of it. They'll be no better than the dolls in the mortal shops, and the trains will be dull, but what else can I do? Let me help, said Holly. Nicholas turned doubtful eyes to her. Have you ever made a doll? Yes, I have. I'll show you. And Holly jumped up, scattering papers as she ran to her workroom to retrieve her little clay models. She returned with her skirt held out before her, forming a basket for her work. Look, she said, dropping down before her father. He peered into the heap of figures and faces. He picked up a replica of Viviana and one of Sophia and studied them wonderingly. You made these? He asked, astonished. They're remarkable. Viviana regarded her clay portrait. Brushing the face with her hand, she murmured softly, You've made me so lovely, Holly. Nicholas smiled. It's a perfect likeness, my dear. You see, said Holly, returning to her father in triumph, I can make the faces. I can make lots of them in 2 months, too. Can you do as well in porcelain? Inquired Nicholas. I don't see why not. Nicholas looked down at the face he held in his hands. Quite interesting. Miss Malibran, she would love it. Well, can I? Asked Holly. Her parents glanced at each other, wordlessly telegraphing their pleasure with their daughter. Of course you may, my darling, said Viviana. That will be most useful, said Nicholas, using an appropriate business-like tone, and shook his daughter by the hand to seal the bargain. Holly began to work in the doll workshop. Almost at once she made an important discovery. She had never been so happy in her life. Finally, after all her years of hoping, she was doing something for the mortals. And when she left the workshop in the evening, with Tundra walking quietly by her side, Holly looked around at the immortals stepping through the streets and did not feel ashamed. She lifted her head and grinned at a centaur who was galloping home with a basket on his hairy arm. Evening, your highness, he said politely, and then flashed her an enormous, toothy smile. He doesn't blame me, she thought. Her step became lighter. Of course, it did not escape her notice that the workshop was nearly empty. Nicholas insisted it was the cold that accompanied Holly that kept the others away, but she knew better. Normally, the place was humming with goblins, gilfins, and fauns, who delighted in dolls and doll-making. It was quiet now that she was there, for the old stories lived on, and most of the magical creatures believed that to be in her presence was to be at risk from Heracon. Only 3 immortals were brave enough to take the chance. The old goblin Raka, who spoke so little that no one knew if he understood that he was in danger. A lavender gilfin named the Lehima, who declared loudly that he would protect Holly against every intruder with his 6 arms, which he then flexed for her one by one. and Holly's old champion Maxu, who hugged her with all his strength and settled his chair at her side. "Tell me," he said cheerfully. "Tell me everything that's happened since the last time I saw you." So Holly chatted with her friend, but when it came time to work, she grew quiet. She closed her eyes and saw a face. Where did it come from? Was it a child she had seen in her telescope? Or was it simply a mirage floating in her mind? Her hands shaping the thick porcelain followed the contours of her vision. Without opening her eyes, she stroked 2 round cheeks into existence, curled a chin like a wave, and coaxed a small nose into a point. Her eyes flew open, and she made the brows, the forehead, and a mouth open as if to talk. "Welcome," she breathed to her creation and laid it on a table. For Raka and Thelahima were in charge of limbs. Maxu watched speechlessly in the chair next to her. "How did you do that? You made a perfect face without a mold in less than 5 minutes, he spluttered. "I don't know how I do it," said Holly, coming back from the dreamy world she inhabited when she made dolls. "You're magic," he squealed. Tundra, who had been snoozing in the corner, lifted his head and looked warily at Maxu. Holly just shook her head. "If you can't fly, you're not magic," she said. Even after long hours at the workshop, Holly continued to long for the Empire City, and when the 5 friends gathered every evening for supper, their conversation usually turned to the puzzle of how and when Holly's journey was to be achieved. Again and again, Tundra and Holly pondered the clue that Emililis had presented to Holly, and Sophia's strange response. Alexia proposed increasingly preposterous plans for escape, such as bribing the Griffin or disguising Holly as her father on Christmas Eve. Empy racked his brains for a way to be of use. He had even gone so far as to leave Holly's rooms to search for Emililis himself. But 2 fairy sisters, Io and Pialana, had pounced on him in the Hall of Mirrors and chased him from one end to the other until he had fled back to Holly's lap in despair. Euphemia was silent. The more that Holly and Tundra discussed the problem, the quieter she became. Each night, as they began to pursue the topic anew, Euphemia flew into the farthest branch, sank her snowy head deep into her chest, and slept, or seemed to sleep. One dark November night, as the wind howled, Holly draped herself over a pile of pillows and said, for the 1000th time, "There must be some way out." And for the 1000th time, Tundra asked, "But what?" There was a squawk from the silver trees. "Stop it!" cried Euphemia. "Stop saying that! Do something!" Holly sat up. "But what?" "That's what he keeps saying," squalled Euphemia. "I can't bear it. I'm only a stupid owl who doesn't know anything, but I don't understand why you both sit here every night saying the same thing. Get up. Do something." "What would you advise us to do?" asked Tundra. Euphemia looked nervously from one to the other. "Research." Holly smiled. "What kind of research, dear?" Euphemia turned her head away so they couldn't see her face. "Well," she said, "studying, reading. I mean to say, weren't there lots of ways to get into the land of the immortals in the old days? I don't remember myself, but it stands to reason that there were, maybe. You should study the history books. Find a secret passageway, maybe." Holly sat up straight. "You're exactly right, Euphemia. We'd need to do some research. We've been terribly dense." She jumped to her feet and shook out her skirts. "A secret passageway," she repeated thoughtfully. "I'm going to Papa's study." Euphemia seemed to grow several inches taller. "Research," she said proudly. Nonetheless, their first attempt was not successful. Holly pored over a book entitled Forever in a Day, and Tundra flipped through magical handbooks as quickly as was possible for a creature without hands. Euphemia, whose pride was greater than her reading skills, was found with numerous books upside down in her talons, and eventually announced that her job was to be lookout. When the 3 finally tottered back to Holly's suite at 4 a.m, they had found nothing, but Holly refused to be discouraged. She brought books from her father's library into her sitting room and studied them, searching anew for a clue, an idea, a hope. "It says here that a convoy of gnomes floated here on a magical boat in 1521, said Tundra. "Oh, never mind. The boat was blown up by albagenes in 1523. "The rock came by magic carpet, according to Dappertudo," Holly said several hours later. "He did? Couldn't he fly?" Doesn't say, but the carpet returned to Persia afterward, so that won't work. Silence hung over the room. For a long time, the only sound was a shushing of turning pages. Holly sighed. Holly! It was Euphemia, high up in her silver branches. Yes, dear, replied Holly absently, picking up a book called Immortal Journeys. Well, why don't you look in that big book? Which big book? That big one in your father's study, on the stand. Holly stared at the owl. The Book of Forever. Yes, that's the one, replied Euphemia. Holly was already running towards the study. How many pages were there in the Book of Forever? Thousands? Tens of thousands? More? Holly read every one, and as the days slipped into December, she read of heroes, magical epochs, and immortal history, but no secret passageways. Each time she thought she had found something, she was informed that it had disappeared, been transformed, or is now accursed. There was only one name that offered even a glimpse of a possibility. It was called the Boreal Rainbow. She came to Tundra with the massive book in her arms. What do you think of this? She asked tiredly. It's the Boreal Rainbow, a rainbow made of light of the Aurora Borealis. Listen. Appearing only once every 500 years, the Boreal Rainbow signals the opening of a passage between the mortal and immortal worlds. Its brief duration as well as its radiant colors make it an astonishing sight to the mortals, who often mistake it for a signal of a great empire's end. What do you think? Once every 500 years, he reminded her. When was the last one? Doesn't say. Holly looked searchingly at the book. But that could be it, couldn't it? Tender looked at her with pity. Yes, maybe that's the one. Chapter 15.